Hi, and welcome to the Big 40 podcast. It's Steph here with some additional thoughts on this week's episode with Shā Sparks. So I thought I'd drop them in a short solo episode as sort of a bonus happy hour with you. If you listen to this week's episode, you may recall that Shā shared her journey of breaking free from an abusive relationship and finding healing. Not by getting all of the answers she once thought she needed, but by learning to let go and move forward. She also talked about how shifting her self-talk from self-doubt and criticism to compassion played a huge role in her transformation. Today, I want to dig deeper into these two powerful themes: releasing the need for understanding in order to heal, and the importance of changing your self-talk. Because if you're in the middle of a big life transition, these shifts could make your journey a whole lot easier. Now, if you didn't listen to Shā's episode, no worries. There's going to be plenty here for you to dig into. I don't think I've called out this theme before after a conversation with one of my guests, so this is a good one to start with. Let's talk about releasing the need for understanding in order to heal. Shā talked about how one of the biggest turning points in her healing was letting go of the need to make sense of what happened to her. When we experience trauma, betrayal, or major life disruptions, we often get stuck in this loop of trying to make sense of why. Why did this happen? Why did this person treat me this way? Why did I stay so long? But as Shā realized, some things don't have rational explanations. At one point, she was talking about looking for the logical explanation or the rational explanation. But the simple fact of the matter was that her partner at the time was not acting logically or rationally, so those explanations were never going to come. And it's highly likely that the people who hurt us may not even understand their own behavior. So seeking logic in that dysfunction simply keeps us trapped in that pain. And there's an alternative here. And that alternative is shifting from why did this happen to how do I move forward? Because this is a more direct path to healing. And I have some of this in my own rearview mirror and in my own experience. In past conversations, I've talked about how a part of my transition was realizing that doing everything I was supposed to didn't bring the fulfillment that I expected it to based on what I had been told. And I started to get unstuck when I stopped looking for an explanation about why things didn't turn out as planned and instead focused on what comes next. I've had many guests who have gone through major career shifts, and people often search for a reason their old job has become unfulfilling. But the people who successfully transition into a new career or a new situation usually realize they don't need a perfect explanation before taking their next step. Heck, I didn't even realize my own why until years after I had made my career transition. So let's go back to episode 99, where I met Julie Hutsell Starling. She provides us another lovely example of this concept. Julie was trapped in a toxic, emotionally volatile relationship with someone who displayed clear red flags: anger issues, lying, manipulation. And she knew deep down that he wasn't right for her. And she even talked about moments where she recognized she was, quote unquote, dating her mom and reliving the emotional instability of her childhood. But despite being able to identify these patterns, she still struggled to leave. She attempted to break up with this person multiple times, but was drawn back in, oftentimes because he suddenly became more attentive as she tried to pull away. It's that very typical push-pull in some of these not so healthy relationships. After years of this turbulence, she came upon an unexpected catalyst that helped her break free. She was packing for a trip and she heard the song True Companion by Mark Cohn, and that triggered something for her. The lyrics of that song, she realized that she deeply, deeply wanted a partner who would have her back, and that this person was never going to be that. And At that point in the story, Julie didn't really spend the time to try to understand why he was the way he was, or why she had stayed so long, or why he wasn't going to be her true companion. So instead of analyzing that behavior or waiting for an apology, she just took that next step. She prioritized herself, and she broke up with him as soon as she returned from that trip. She didn't demand closure. She didn't need a perfect explanation for why the relationship had happened the way it did. And she didn't wait for him to finally acknowledge her worth. Instead, she made that choice to move forward on her own terms. So Julie's story is another reminder that closure isn't always necessary or even possible. We may never get the answers we think we need from past relationships, from jobs, from life situations. But what we can do, what we do have the power to do, is to stop seeking explanations that keep us stuck and instead take a step towards something better. So if you are feeling trapped in a situation that no longer serves you, ask yourself, do I really need an explanation to move on? Or could I choose to release that need and just take the next best step forward? If you find yourself going in circles, always looking for answers, and this could be anywhere in your life. It could be career, it could be relationships, it could be personal growth, it could be any different part of your life. Or this could be a larger picture issue for you and it affects multiple areas. But if you find yourself going around in circles, could you fathom the possibility of releasing that need for answers? You would not be letting someone else off the hook. You would be letting yourself off the hook by doing that. Because if you were to accept that some things won't ever make sense, that leaves you in a position to ask the question, what's the next step I can take today towards the thing that I do want in my life? Let me try saying this another way. If you are struggling to let go of something painful in your past, maybe ask yourself, am I waiting for an answer that's never going to come? What would it look like to release that need for closure and focus on next steps? Because healing isn't always about solving the puzzle that is our past. Sometimes it's just about reclaiming your power in the present. And action equals power. So taking an action, moving forward, taking one simple step forward is one way you can do that. Okay, the second thing I want to dig into from my conversation with Shā is the importance of changing your self-talk. Shā talked about how her healing really began when she changed the way she spoke to herself. And once she changed the way she spoke to herself, that actually waterfalled down and changed the way she spoke to other people, which was really an interesting point. And I've talked about this before, whether you realize it or not, your inner dialogue can either reinforce your pain or propel you forward. So many of us carry the voices of our past, whether it's our parents, our partners, or society, or friends, without realizing how those words, how those voices are shaping our self-worth. And when Shā shifted from self-criticism to a more compassionate way of talking to herself, everything in her life started to change. And I think that's a hugely, hugely important thing to point out. The worse you're being to yourself in your head, the more stuck you're going to be. The nicer you can be to yourself in your head, the more things will open up in front of you. And that is another lesson that I have learned firsthand for sure. And another guest who learned this lesson was Jeff Glauser back in episode 96. For years, Jeff struggled with imposter syndrome, with self-doubt, and with pretty terrible self-talk. He described how he felt like he was always on the 1-yard line of success, but never able to actually score that touchdown. And every missed opportunity reinforced his belief that he just wasn't good enough. And over time, this really created a self-perpetuating cycle where he stopped believing in himself and he settled for a life that he felt was mediocre, even though deep down he knew he wanted more. His turning point came when he was 42, when he woke up on his birthday to a panic attack. He said that was a literal wake-up call that he couldn't ignore. And in that moment, he realized his external struggles were reflections of the internal narrative he had been telling himself for years. So the trouble he was having with his career, with his finances, with his relationships were all reflections of the mean things he was saying to himself in his head. And a big shift happened for Jeff when he stopped telling himself the story that he was stuck or that he was a failure. Because instead of saying, I always get so close, but I never make it, or I'll never figure this out, or I'm too far gone to change, he started to reframe his mindset. And he focused on very small and very achievable wins. His way of changing this mindset was to build a daily habit system where he committed to just doing something rather than overwhelming himself with impossible expectations. One of the most powerful examples of this was how he changed his relationship with exercise, because for years he saw fitness as this big all or nothing pursuit. If you couldn't do a full workout, then you might as well not do anything. But instead of that overwhelming, self-defeating mindset, he said, what if I did just one push-up? And of course, once he got down on the ground and did the one push-up, it usually led to more than one. So that one push-up would lead to a set. And that set turned into a consistent workout routine. And now, 5 years later, exercise is this non-negotiable part of his life. And this all happened because he changed the way he talked to himself. The same principle applied to other areas of his life. He also focused on, over time, meditation, journaling, finances, relationships. But each time he focused on really small, really manageable, really achievable steps that allowed him to build some momentum, which then also rewrote that internal narrative from, I always fall short, to, hey, I make progress every day, which is a really profound shift. It may not sound it, but again, if all you're hearing over and over in your head is, I always fall short, or I always screw up, or I never finish, and instead you start saying, hey, I did a push-up today. That's an achievement. That's positive. That's supportive. So Jeff's transformation demonstrates that success doesn't have to be about massive changes. It can come from tiny shifts in self-talk that build on themselves over time. So if you're struggling with self-doubt or with a really mean or negative internal dialogue, start small. Instead of thinking, I have to fix everything, maybe try asking, what's one really small thing I can do today that would be positive? Because your self-talk shapes your reality. I talked about this last week at the end of Marcy's episode. So this piece is a recurring theme, and it's such a recurring theme that I have talked about how a mentor gave me an exercise that helped me change my inner dialogue and get a handle on that very loud, very mean voice in my head. So if you want to know more about that exercise, drop me a line and I will send it to you. But if you're in the midst of your midlife transition, please take a moment and think about how you speak to yourself. Do you sound like a terrible, harsh critic or a supportive friend? And are you repeating old narratives that no longer serve you? If the answer is yes to that second question, it's time to rewrite the script, because the way you talk to yourself shapes the life you build. So many of my guests have overcome major personal challenges, things like divorce, addiction, career burnout, healing from toxic relationships and behavior patterns that hold them back. And a huge part of moving forward from adversity is learning to be kinder to yourself and shifting away from that self-defeating narrative. Both of these themes today reinforce the idea that transformation starts within. Last week, after my interview with Marcy Langlois, I talked about how we can dig up the unconscious thoughts, patterns, and beliefs that are running in the background of our minds, that are shaping our lives, often without us realizing it. And I shared 5 tips on how to do that. So if you're interested, I would be happy to send that to you in written form, if that's a better way for you to absorb it. So drop me a line if you would like to see that. And I would be curious to hear your thoughts on these 2 themes. What is your experience with releasing the need for understanding in order to heal? Have you been able to do that in the past, or are you still stuck looking for closure or explanations or understanding? And how are you doing on changing your self-talk? What tips or tricks have you used to tame that mean voice in your head? All right, one last thing before I go. I never know whether I should include these insights right after the interview in that same episode, or if that makes the episodes too long and you'd rather listen to something more bite-sized in another sitting. So I would love some input from you on which you prefer. Insights right after the conversation, or take a day or two to reflect and then come back for a second time to delve into the themes a little bit deeper. Drop me a line, Stephanie@thebig40.com, and spell out all those words. There's no numbers in there. I'd be happy to do it either way, but I'm most happy to do it the way that works best for you. So thanks so much for sticking with me. I'll see you next time.